Hello, everybody. This is Professor Keegan, and I am coming to you with a quick video lecture on the material to prepare for watching V for Vendetta, which I have also linked in our Moodle page as a streaming video link. So you should be able to watch from the safety and security of your home space and not deal with the 3 feet of snow outside. So please do watch. And I'm looking forward to seeing what people think of this film. It is the last film we are watching in the first half of the course. And when we come back from reading week, we'll take up Velvet Goldmine as the next Haynes film in this course. So what I will do today is briefly offer some condensed comments on the reading material. I think the assessment of the film that I assigned is quite straightforward, but the Steinbach piece may need a slight explication. I'm offering that piece to you simply as one way of showing how we can think through cinematic form itself as a kind of trans medium. We've talked a bit about queerness as, the queer pleasures of cinema and what it affords in terms of cross-gender identification and fluidity of identification. But Steinbach's piece offers us some ideas about the actual mechanics of film language and how they might also be open to being interpreted as a kind of trans process of meaning making. And I think that's particularly relevant for this film because this film um, is working in with it, referencing actually an earlier kind of iteration of transness from the 1970s that became popularized with the transsexual slasher. So here we have a heroic trans, I would argue, figure who is doing a lot of the same cutting of things that we see in like Dress to Kill or Sleepaway Camp or even a later film like The Silence of the Lambs. But this figure is cutting at the state's logic, right? Instead of cutting up people's bodies in revenge, the revenge is articulated against state and fascist power. So I'll talk a bit about that, but I think Steinbach, it helped that article helps us think a bit about what this film might offer in terms of technique and some resonances there with earlier film history. So to note, V for Vendetta was actually directed by James McTeague, who is the Wachowskis' assistant director on the Matrix trilogy. The Wachowskis wrote the screenplay for this film, adapting the graphic novel, um, and they did credited second unit directing also, or shooting. So you will sometimes notice, especially in the action sequences, a very Wachowskian approach which often illustrates that they did have some involvement in the actual direction of the picture. They're just uncredited directors. So we treat this as a kind of co-directed piece of work, but of course highly influenced by their take on the original comics run by Alan Moore. So what I will do is take you forward to this slide. I've only prepared one slide on Steinbach because, again, I gave you an excerpt of this reading. It's quite dense, but I think it would help um, get you thinking about how cinematic process and trans identity can be thought of as similar, right? Um, this is Eliza Steinbach, who's a leading transgender and fine arts cinema studies scholar. Um, their book is called Shimmering Images, and this is an early piece of that book from maybe about 10 years ago. And I want to note also that when we say transsexuality, we're using an earlier formation of trans, right? A formation that was typified by medical science as a disorder in the mid 20th century and was the dominant way of understanding transness up until probably the 1990s. So for 30 years, transsexuality was the way that we understood gender dysphoria and gender transition as treatment for that. Um, so when Steinbach uses it, they're just periodizing themselves to think about um, the role that cinematic industrial production and the mechanics of transsexual gender transition are similar in some ways. So, um, One thing to note is that Steinbach is addressing a problem that defined a lot of early work in transgender studies. And this problem is twofold, okay? First of all, it should be Steinbach, not Steinbach. I apologize. First of all, there's the problem of gendered language, right? Certainly in Romance languages, this is a huge issue, but also in English as a language that dropped a lot of our gendered terms, but keeps gendered pronouns, right? Language just locks down our understanding of gender assignment and bifurcates gender into these dualisms, right? So there is no truly, at least in the West, neutered gender neutral language. So that's a problem. And then also discourse or the way that language is used to create meaning, right? Discourse is controlled by institutions that have defined transness as something to be cured or fixed, a disorder of some kind, right? So the very language we speak already is gendered, already prevents gender fluidity, already assigns gender, and discourse has already determined that attempting to speak from a transposition automatically renders you as disordered. Like you're there, that subject position is always already predetermined as coming from a position of gender disorder or gender uh like problematics, right? So early writing and trans studies took up this problem of like there not being a language to speak that was open to trans meaning making, and there not being a position to speak from that wasn't already medicalized as pathological, crazy, disordered, etc., right? Um, so the two kind of founding essays in trans studies, Sandy Stone's The Empire Strikes Back, and Susan Stryker's My Words to Victor Frankenstein Above the Village of Chamonix both take up this problem of there not being proper language for trans embodiments and identities, and there also being no position from which within discourse to speak that was open to trans occupation. So Steinbach is like, hey, what if we thought about cinema as a medium that could express transness without language necessarily, right? Um, so the trans subject has no subject position from which to speak and no language to use to just to capture their experience of gender. So Steinbach instead proposes cinema as a medium through which transsexual meaning might be expressed outside of language. So Steinbach is making the case for cinema as a system of meaning making that is non-linguistic and therefore is open to certain kinds of transitions and conjunctions with its own kind of internal um, system of sign making and system of narrative production that doesn't require language. So how might that be open to trans meaning making or expression without putting the trans subject in this stranded scenario of there being only gendered language and no position from which to act as not already a symptom, right? A symptom of a problem. So Steinbach theorizes both transsexuality and cinema as, quote, expressing themselves through cutting. And the idea of the cut, right, is foundational to cinematic language. It's how cinematic narrativity and temporality are produced through cuts, um, through missing time or missing content, right? We would cut from one thing to another in a body of celluloid, right, that then produces a narrative or produces our sense of of an event taking place, literally through time missing rather than representing all of it, right? And Steinbach says this is similar to how transsexuality in the 20th century was conceptualized to express its own desire to be gendered a certain way through a cutting of the body. And you can see this tradition in 20th century cinema about trans difference, right? A lot of the trans figures in the cinema of the 60s and 70s particularly use knives and actually cut up their victims or cut up um their oppressors. So there's a connection here between like the knife and the trans body and the pellicule or celluloid that's cut up to tell a story and rearranged. So Steinbeck argues for thinking about how cinema might, quote, express itself like transsexuality and how transsexuality might express itself like cinema. So what they're really arguing for is what is called a soma technical approach, meaning soma, Latin for the body, and technic, Latin for machine, right? That the body and technology are have never really been separate in human history. That bodies are always already the products of some kind of technology, and that the two things intermesh, so that we can't have transsexuality without a language or system of cinematic communication, right? And we can't have cinema the way we understand it, Steinbach would argue, without transsexuality being invoked also as a similar set of meaning-making actions on the body of the film or the body of the person. So Steinbach's arguing these two things go together and act very similar to one another. Now, this is a back formation of a point I make in my book about the Matrix, where the Matrix digitizes these things, right? Like the Matrix, there aren't any cuts anymore, or the cut is dematerialized by the presence of digital technology and the pixel rather than the pellicule or celluloid, right? So when we get to the idea of the body being totally separate from, or the body and the identity, gender identity being separate and not requiring surgery, right? And we get this idea of transgender being an internal identity that precedes and overwrites the body, doesn't need to cut the body up, but overwrites its meaning. Then we get into how transgender kind of came along and replaced this mode. So in many ways, V for Vendetta is working in a very 20th century um, idiom, right? Of cutting and rearranging versus the Matrix working in a very millennial or postmodern mode of transcending and actually deconstructing these relations. Construction, deconstruction, right? So I just wanted to expose you to this argument because I think it really helps in the interpretation of this film where we have a hero who cuts, right? And who's trying to tell a different story about history than the state will permit. In this film, the state has completely taken over via a fascist regime any understanding of history, any understanding of the past. It has completely banned all kinds of things. And those things are supposed to be treated as if they don't exist or never did, right? So here we have V, the title character, as a character who's evoking a certain kind of, I argue, transsexual aesthetics, but in a left politically aligned way, where this cutting is about a recutting of history to tell a different story than the North Fire state would have people believe, right? So V kind of becomes like a film director of history, trying to produce a new edit, right? To unedit the edit that Northfire has produced. So in this section of the book, right, I point the reader to the fact that V, the character from the original comic book series V for Vendetta, which was originally imagined by Alan Moore as a trans hero, as a trans kind of anti-hero. Um, called The Doll, which is amazing considering if you know anything about trans discourse nowadays, the dolls is a common term used in trans feminine community for various like, trans celebrities, trans influencers, right? Trans beauty influencers particularly. Um, but yeah, The Doll was the name of this character originally and got edited. It became a non-trans character, but my argument is that there's something about V even in the film version, all the way in 2005, right, 20 years later, that retains this kind of aesthetics of transsexuality. Um, right? And I argue that the film is the most left-aligned use of transsexual aesthetics in popular film history. Probably only uh, the only competing text I would argue that's similar is probably something like Rocky Horror Picture Show, right? In terms of how both of these films, this one and Rocky Horror, are interested in assemblage and cutting and reassembling, With Rocky, it's a lot about about genre and cutting up genre and reassembling it into a kind of like a monstrous Frankenstein's monster of a film. And this film is interested in cutting up the state's discourse and rearranging it to make new meaning. But both of them are using a kind of trans aesthetics of the cut, right? Um, I think I had you look at a small section introducing this section of the book called Red Pill, where I talk about dissent. And because V for Vendetta is a film about dissent, and if you look at the root formation of the word dissent in Latin, it doesn't mean to protest, it means to feel differently, right? To not consent, feel the same, is to dissent, feel differently. And if we think about dissent as rooted in an experience of sensing differently, then we can start to see how trans dissent might be um, articulated against a state pushing a fascist regime of there not being a possibility of any kind of change. That kind of like, and we see this now, right, with the US and the politics that are spreading. The state is becoming almost like Norse fire, right, in some ways. So dissenting against authoritarianism is to sense differently and to insist that a different way of sensing is still possible outside the propagandistic editing of history the state is producing all the time. V stages this trans dissent against authoritarianism by passing within, right? And across, to use that crossing of trans, across the same propagandistic forms used by the state, inhabiting them and sabotaging them. So when you watch this, I want you to think about what different kinds of dissent and resistance look like because V does not necessarily stand in the public square and hold a sign up and protest in the way that we think standard kind of liberal protest would be conducted. Instead, he weaponizes the same exact methods the state uses against the state. He is able to occupy and mimic them, right? So if you think about mimicry and passing and taking on forms that are not assigned to you, right? That's another way that V kind of like moves within the logic of the fascist state, only to then disable its mechanisms and hook them up to other mechanisms. So I argue that because V could be anybody, we don't know who V really is. And also V is nobody, meaning we don't know who V is, and V also has no body. We never see V's face, we don't see any of their exposed flesh. They are a hollow figure with no discrete gender or sex, and also kind of a sort of gender fuck presentation where Hugo Weaving is actually playing V. And Hugo Weaving has this very deep, mellifluous voice, but the presentation of the character is a very kind of sort of femme expression, a kind of almost like 16th century kind of presentation of courtly uh, high femme masculinity or something like courtly presence, right? V is a kind of figure who's out of time. He's in the wrong place in the wrong time. And I talk about the role of anachronism in his characterization, right? Um, because there are two things he's doing as I argue as principal trans tactics, right? The first is anachronism or the cutting of time, right? Cutting across time and cutting and mixing time up. Not only is V referencing a character, Guy Fawkes, actually a real historical figure who was caught trying to bomb Parliament in I believe, the 1500s, right? So animating a body from the past and bringing that body into the present in this way that's very anachronistic. But V also is saving all of these historical items or artifacts from all different periods of time that Norse Fire has tried to ban. So the Shadow Gallery, where all this is kept and preserved, represents all these different sorts of time signatures. Um, so V, as a kind of hollow body, is able to collect up different kinds of time and save that time against the state's regime of erasure. So this practice of anachronism and this practice of what I call vestibularity, because I like to use a lot of V words in this part of the book, and you'll see why, because V uses a lot of V words. Um, but vestibularity or acting as a vestibule or a reservoir for all these kinds of time that the state has tried to erase. Um, so my argument here is that the film is using these transsexual aesthetics to um, animate V as an anarchic body politic, right? Um, Sir Alan Moore criticized the film, saying that because it doesn't talk directly about anarchist theory, that it's a less radical text than the graphic novel. But I would argue that the actual animation or enlivenment of V's body it, via the moving image versus a still comic book uh, actually gives anarchism a sort of an aesthetics of movement in this film, and a particularly trans one. Uh, so when you think about like Neo and V and how they are similar and different, they're facing similar problems, but their tactics are very different and reference different times in history. Um, a little about the film, right? I mentioned that it's directed by James McTeague. With secondary shooting and screenplay by the Wachowskis. This was their first film after completing Matrix Revolutions in 2003, which is the third Matrix film, the fourth if you count the Animatrix. Their prior assistant director, James McTeague, was directing this piece. They handed it off to him because I think they were working on other projects. Uh, they wrote the screenplay and did uncredited second unit shooting. So the Wachowski kind of imprint is here, and I think you'll sense it. And just to ground you in history, if you haven't read the original comic series, the film is based on a 1988 to 89 DC Vertigo series, comic series of the same name, V for Vendetta, that was very much a criticism of Thatcherite England. It was very rooted in that historical time period and was talking about the sort of takeover of British government by neoconservatives, right? In the US, the competing model would be Reagan, right? We know Thatcher and Reagan were buddies and they actually had a shared neoliberal plan they called TINA, right? Which was this idea that they were going to kind of force through all these neoliberal practices and de like basically privatize the global economy. TINA stood for There Is No Alternative. And so it's kind of a fascist imagination of like the idea that you just remove people's ability to know there's any other way of doing things, which is a very matrixy as well when you think about it. So this is a perfect project for the Wachowskis to pick up. But what they do with V for Vendetta is instead of locating it in the time in history it was originally written, they bring it forward. They bring it forward into a kind of any time, right? So they universalize some of the conditions in a way that makes it more translatable to our current moment, because it's not about Thatcherite England anymore. It's about fascism writ large. Um, Moore didn't like that they did this and said that it made the text less radical. I would argue, hey, like maybe it's less specific, but it also has a broader reach, right? So, for example, it was only after this film popularized the fox mask as a symbol that Anonymous, the hacktivist collective Anonymous, started using it. So clearly, the film had some broader impact on these radical left groups, despite it not actually saying the word anarchist in the script, right? There's something it evokes or depicts cinematically that's unsaid linguistically, right? To go back to Steinbach, but expressed anyway via its aesthetics. So very curious to see what you think of this film. I think you'll enjoy it. Um, and I know a number of you are planning on writing about it. I remember you're supposed to be turning in your rationale today. So I wanted to make sure you had these slides and also the streaming link to the film. And now, one thing to think about is that we are now halfway through all of the media content in the course. So we should be developing as a community, as an intellectual community, an idea of a kind of global analysis of where we've been. Like, what are the shared themes that are emerging across these works? We've talked about a few of them. I have the feeling we are all in prison, being an animated an animating question, the question of the prison. Where is it located? How is it concealed or imposed? And then the idea of getting out of the prison versus coming out within it. Recognition versus escape have been two themes we've been talking about a lot. But there are more things that are showing up, and we're going to want to think about shared themes and also points of tension because we've also talked about how Haynes is in some ways a less optimistic filmmaker than the Wachowskis. The Wachowskis tend to be really interested in the speculative and in escape, externalization and escape, whereas Haynes tends to be much more interested in the internalization of oppression into the psyche, and he's much more interested in melodramatics versus speculation, meaning the system preventing certain things from happening, right? And we feel the injustice of that. And that's an important experience for Haynes, as you feeling in the injustice versus escaping it, right? So there are very different approaches to the same, maybe fundamental problems. And remember that the major goal of our course is to ask what we can learn about queer and trans life by putting these directors in conversation. What are some larger um, observations or takeaways about the fundamental problem that queer and trans people face and potential solutions and or coping mechanisms for those problems? And then how are those aestheticized via cinema? What does cinema offer us that perhaps other mediums do not when it comes to aestheticizing these problems that politics have proven insufficient to resolve? Okay? So I will leave this here. I am not seeing you again till after spring break. Spring, yeah, right. Have you seen the 3 feet of snow? I think we call it reading week, right? There's no midterm in this course, but we are gonna, in the second half, be working to develop your project pretty intensely. So make sure to turn in your rationale by the end of the day. And we look forward to seeing what you're going to focus on. And I do hope a few of you have decided to focus on media from the second half of class because there's some really good films and televisual series coming up. Okay? All right, so that's that. I hope you all stay safe from the snow and please send me any questions via email. Okay, bye.